Good afternoon, everyone. A bit of a frantic rush there. I'm a couple of minutes late of getting off a Zoom meeting. You know what it's like. Hope you can hear me okay. Can never tell. As ever, has saved my paranoia. Drop us an emoji, a hello, a yes, I can hear you. Criticize the hair. That's usually a favorite. Banter the accent, another favorite. So yeah, another week. What a week we had last week on Chewing It Over. Those of you that tune in on a regular, um, I just, it was a really fun one. A few guests on, who's always brilliant. And then the Friday, obviously, things got fiery and started talking about private practice and NHS stuff, which was fun. Jem, thanks a lot. She said I'm tardy. It doesn't mean she's giving me any clues as to whether she can hear. I think she'd be telling me if if I couldn't hear. But anyway, that's great. Thank you, Jem, and thank you. I'm gonna quote you later, Gemma Oliver, Little Miss Support Network. That's as I call her. Now this is a big deal for me. Sean O'Neill tuning in on LinkedIn, which makes me nervous. Old boss from a former life, and he said the hair's nice, which I can only judge, as you can hopefully see from his picture, a man who knows good hair. And so yeah, thanks, Sean. I'm glad you're tuning in. So today, what we're going to be chewing over is a little bit of a reflection on what happened last week. Certainly, that was a bit of a spicy week. And then and then it's going to be a bit of a COVID update, especially with regards to all things that have been happening and how it's influencing private practice. There's been some challenges that come from the test and trace systems, and whether or not you need a QR code. I think it's about as interesting as when the shoulda we shouldn't we be wearing visors type things like that. So I've also seen a number of people wearing masks on Zoom meetings, and I don't mean in communal areas. I mean that they're just people losing their mind a little bit and forgetting what PPE is for. So I thought we might as well talk it through and try and calm each other's nerves a little bit, which would be useful. But yeah, one of the things that I want to throw out to you, in case you haven't spotted it, in case people don't know what I'm on about, is that last week, towards the end of the week, there was a really interesting thread, 200 plus comments on Facebook, and also it sort of spilled over a little bit into Twitter, Instagram. Is this notion of what is or isn't relevant in the differences and relevant distinctions in private practice and NHS care, and what the motivating factors are when things are different, how relevant the stereotypes are. Do they play, and is there something to it, or is that painting with too broad a brush? All sorts of stuff like that. So for those of you that are tuning in now that maybe didn't get a chance to weigh in end of last week, I'd love to know your thoughts as to whether or not you feel any of that is of relevance, whether it needs to just sort of die itself out, or whether or not you think we need to sort of discuss that a bit further. Tomorrow we've got Adam Meekins coming on the show. He's going to be discussing a bit of a rant that he had that took off. You know what he's like, and he liked his rants, and so he put one up over the weekend about marketing, which I thought was interesting. We can talk it through, see what we agree or disagree on, and sort of chew over this notion that he was frustrated over some of the marketing that he's clearly coming across, maybe some paid advertising that's turning up on his feed, so he was railing against it. And there was a massive amount of support for his position on it, but also people wanting to offer some distinctions as to what might be relevant. And it'd be interesting just to sort of hear out Adam's take on that. So he's going to be joining me tomorrow at 12:30, usual time. But in the meantime, yeah, what's your thoughts on the all things private practice versus NHS? And unfortunately, it did become a bit of a versus. And what I wanted to sort of start the show on today, in case these other comments come up, then we'll definitely take your lead on that. But what I wanted to sort of think about is something we didn't get really chance to really flesh out at the end of last broadcast on Friday, was that it is my take that in an ideal world, what would be optimal for all of our patients and for society at large is better collaboration across sectors. But as has been proven sometimes by the commentary when something like this gets raised, is that it feels like we're actually a bit of a way from doing that. And it certainly doesn't seem like there's the political will or the policymakers in the health quangos and the people that might make that work. I don't know if they have the knowledge or the acumen to probably make that happen. But as it goes, the facility in MSK for the private sector to help with some of the challenging burdens that come, not just in a health sense, but in terms of just the traffic that's going to be flowing through those departments. Sensible collaboration with local examples of decent collaboration could really help things. And just the challenges are threefold. There's the actual pragmatic application of whether we can converse in the same language. Some of the stuff we talked about end of last week. Can we see eye to eye enough to have a model that's in common, that you can trust, under those cliches we talked about last week, is that can NHS practitioners trust their local private practices to work under a model that makes it that they don't feel like they're just going to be bleeding all these patients for profit? And similarly, can the private practitioners and trust their local NHS clinicians to not be sort of complacent or peddling sheets of exercises and stuff and not individualising care? Now, as we talked about, I consider them to be stereotypes that aren't representative of the whole, but I think that they are core problems or principles that we need to be able to iron out. And I'd say that would be number one of three reasons as to why, if we can't get that right, then I don't see it being able to progress towards better collaboration. The second thing would be just in terms of infrastructure. What are when someone is seeking, they've sprained their ankle, they've injured their back, they've got a persistent pain of some sort, let's call it OA knee for the sake of it. So they are then seeking MSK services. What are the mechanisms for them to receive that care? Do they go on Google and seek out a private practitioner and recognise they might pay out of pocket or out of insurance for that? Do they go in to see their GP? Do they understand what first contact practice is, or can you self-refer in your area? Whatever channels they may be. Now, if those channels don't then give access to whatever is optimal for that patient at that time, cross-sector, or that there aren't mechanisms for people to be able to deliver that in a collaborative way, or for people to take a bit of pressure off their local MSK services by offering a certain style of care, and for whoever it might be that's signposting to know about that, that's a matter of policy. That's why I say that's not just about better relations between individual clinics and their local NHS departments, right? We all know that there's sometimes very good links there, because often it's the same people. You've got people that work across sectors. You've got people that work in evenings and weekends, etc. in private practice. Might even have a full-time position within an NHS department locally. So I'm never concerned about the fact that there aren't the links, but it's just more as a matter of infrastructure and policy. There's a reason why that distinction is there. There's some blurring of the lines that should occur. And I think one of the obvious examples is some of the more established, what are private practices, private infrastructure, such as, say, Nuffield, which technically operates as a charity, but it's more classically known within the private sector. You imagine that some of the Nuffield MSK network services, be that practices that are associated through Fusion, or be that through their employed physios, maybe being able to offer some MSK help and care, particularly something low-hanging fruit like virtual stuff. You imagine that they were able, through Nuffield, to be able to start offering a way in which the NHS could ease its pressure in our side of the industry. That would be an obvious way in. And then once that precedent was set, that would almost be that independent private practices could find ways in which you could do it. But the first point I said about better relations, better communication, there is still an infrastructure piece that needs to be done with regards to policy, which is the second thing. And I would say that then the third thing is this notion of what appropriate payment looks like across sectors, right? The hourly rate in which someone is typically paid under the same competence level for a day's work, an hour's work, etc., across sectors varies widely. The three classics being, say, private practice, NHS care, and then sport. There's many others, occupational health, etc. But let's just use those examples. And there's reasons for that varying. So the cash value on my time over an hour is going to be different depending on what the contract, the guaranteed work, the whether or not you're paid for, whether a patient turns up or not, the amount of holidays you get, the other work protections that people might have when they consider the package that is their salary and their contract. And so let's not pretend that, given the right relations, and let's say you've got sensible rehab-centric practitioners that are going to be working through a scaled functional model, that doesn't matter whether it's coming into a private practice or going into the NHS department locally, you got that bit right. You've got the infrastructure whereby they can be signposted appropriately. So you've got these policies that can then help the NHS by private practices working together collaboratively, right? You've got those two things in. Now, the third thing is still relevant, is to what is then paid for. How is that then properly remunerated for the clinician that's doing the doing, or the service that's helping to do that, right? So if you've got independent private practices or whatever it might be that are then offering that support, let's not pretend that you've then got to work out what's an appropriate remuneration for that. Now, you've got private practices that also take on NHS contracts. But most of them will tell you that you've got, say, a cash payer, you've got an insurance payer, and then sometimes those levels. But let's just say a cash payer, and then you've got an NHS patient, or what the NHS pays for that patient to come in. Let's say it's 30-minute assessment or appointment, whatever it might be, and there's a certain amount that you charge a customer and a patient, and then there's a certain amount that the NHS would pay for that patient to be seen under what would be tax funded. And there's often a difference there, but the practice is happy to do that because they're guaranteed a certain amount of patients. So sod it, I'll take 25 quid that the NHS have remunerate, but if that patient was to come in and pay cash, then you're in a situation where they may well be paying 40 quid, right? And that's what the practice has decided to do. But when we sort of think about better collaboration or better cross-sector working in its level where we're talking about true integrated success, that actually may well be something that people want to overlook, is that, or they don't get round to having that conversation early enough, so it's going to break down. It's complex, and it's quite a challenge to truly integrate, like we're describing. One of the simpler ways, I would say, is to just at the very least better cooperate, and to get that first bit as well as we can, which is to co-treat more appropriately, and so sometimes people have really strong views on sort of co-treating. I think what I would admit is that can be a challenge in itself, but I would say that better communication between the local practices and their MSK departments would also involve them being more amenable to picking up the phone, to discussing a case, and to not be as protective over the fact that it might be a patient that's been seen privately who then wants to go and see, they've gone up the waiting list, or the local service has started to see patients face to face again, so I'm preferring to go back there. Private practitioner taking the time to smooth that transition when they might otherwise have either not been invited to or wouldn't choose to. Similarly, there may well be that the service that's being delivered by that NHS practice service at the moment is something that the patient is keen to go and see for waiting list reasons, or for the fact that the private practice might be more available for face-to-face appointments, and they meet a threshold for something when they don't want to be seen virtually, or vice versa. That might mean that transition of care, the way to stop us being so tribal is to appropriately communicate that where possible, finding the time, sometimes that time cost or actual cost to the clinician, in the best interest of the patient. Just try and make that as smooth as possible. Write a bit of a summary report, send an email, ideally grab a bit of time on the phone, even if it's 5 minutes. Just try to make sure that goes on, I think, is the low-hanging fruit here. And that at the moment, the state of flux that can occur, because that happens all across time in peacetime, right? But at the moment, that's going to be happening probably, I would argue, a little more, where you've got people that are naturally moving between sides or sectors within the industry. Sectors appropriate. And so just bear that in mind, please. And I would say just, it's in the best interest of the patient for us to be more patient with each other, to be more understanding of these things happening, for us to afford a bit more time. I mean, everyone's pressured and challenged in some of the stuff we're going to talk about in a little bit about COVID, but I just think that's the sort of thing where we need to be giving you some giving each other a bit more space, a bit more understanding. So thank you for those of you that have got in touch with me over the weekend. Hard to get through all the messages, but off the back of Friday, saying that there's a lot of agreement and they were just interested in sort of a take on how to best collaborate. That's sort of my go-to things. There's me three. Interested in your thoughts. Sometimes it's all well and good us talking about collaborating and stuff, but sometimes it's the action, it's the actual doing that's sometimes complicated. So I'd be really interested in what we might be able to think about. So let's have a little look at some of your comments before we get onto some COVID bits. Great points here, of course, from Gemma, saying we need to be better at listening and collaborating together. That's sort of what we're speaking to here, is that we've got to, no matter how, we've got to find a way. It's really interesting when, as Gemma's saying here, we want the same thing. It just has to improve as a whole, and we need to stop the divide, or we're not going to move. Oh, it's blocked there. Not going to move forwards. And then a lovely emoji. Sorry, I couldn't see that. So yeah, of course. And I think never underestimate the fact that in this discussion there are forces that you've got some forces within the public sector that would for ideological reasons, wish to abolish healthcare business. And then you've got other forces within private practice that are so ideologically opposed to the styles of care or whatever it might be, or what they consider to be a stereotype that represents the whole, that they would have that they would be keen for their local NHS MSK department to go under, or for them to celebrate the pains that might be occurring in that side of it. And so, don't underestimate. You've got some people that are not got the best interests at heart of all of these things. So I do think that's certainly a concern that I sometimes have. Let's a great point here from Matt Scarsbrook. Let me pull it up on screen, although it won't show all of it. Let me read this out to you, because this is certainly an interesting point. Is there scope to take these ideas and concepts beyond just private practice physiotherapy, build better working relationships between the NHS and all MSK private practice therapists? And then brackets, his caveat being that they fall within an evidence-based framework. I think that's, and he's mentioned, of course, there that, bearing in mind, not all physios fall into that description, of course. Really good point. Let me take that as a question, because it's a really good point. I think there should be scope. I think challenge of time, and also my experiences within, I think about 6 months ago, I was rallying the troops for the Rehab Recruits campaign and trying to get any qualified and sensibly evidence-informed clinician to join a roster to be able to support the NHS for rehab purposes when we thought it was going to be especially drastic. And to witness the bureaucracy stifle any decent innovation, even at a time of rapid change. So they were able to build Nightingale hospitals, etc., and create the infrastructure through a mass panic, as well as create the finances to make that happen. The fact that they then weren't able to create sensible policy that then bolstered the workforce in a sensible way, it makes me then concerned on a pragmatic level. So, theoretically, I totally agree with what Matt's suggesting there, is that yes, there should be scope, and it would be sensible. What on earth as a society we wouldn't make for optimal opportunity for sensible evidence-informed clinicians of all stripes to best serve society right now at a time of need is just fascinating. Tribalism, bad policy, bad politics, and all sorts of problems. But the pragmatist in me watches on and thinks that how poorly I've seen many of these things be handled at various different levels of policy making makes me then think that if we're not, the low-hanging fruit surely is the fact that you've got these people that are qualified sometimes under the same badge, that there's a legacy treatment and option across sectors there, physiotherapy being just one example of that, but you could say podiatry or occupational therapy. And the fact that those sectors, even under the same stripe, aren't able to collaborate means that it feels like not only the only way, but one way is to, if that was to be smoother and that collaboration was to be smoother, then perhaps you could then move in and start to make a case multidisciplinary. But unfortunately at the moment, and I'm not saying that that's the only way, but I'm just meaning that witnessing it at the moment, it feels like we're not making progress in that direction for various reasons. And I think some of those reasons being that I mentioned infrastructure as being the second of 3 points, and the first one being we can't speak the same language sometimes and get past the stereotypes, and the third point being that we don't have mature conversations about the rates of pay and the complexity in and around that, and who's going to fund it and who should be funding it. And so I would say we can't. One of the reasons we can't seem to move past it and towards something sensible, as is what Matt's hinting at there. That makes me concerned. And so I'm not nihilistic about this stuff, and I always try to keep my chin up and make suggestions as to what would be positive progress. But in this instance, yeah, it just feels like a really silly thing that we seem to be passing by. But as I said, there are some low-hanging fruit on a local level, and that could be demonstrated and translated as good practices for you to be able to collaborate locally and to give us good examples and then share good examples with us. If you're someone that feels like I've actually got a brilliant, harmonious relationship that stood the test of time, or more recently, a really good relationship locally, I'll get you on the show. Don't be shy. Get in touch. Let's get you on. Let's talk that through. It's exactly what this is for. I want to bring in Ruth Cross here, who sent a lovely comment over on LinkedIn, making a point about including locums. Locums have so much to offer. Let me just bring this up here. Disappointingly, managers in the NHS systemically excluded locums throughout COVID-19 in preference to employing inappropriate NHS staffing, such as paediatric physios in adult community work. This is a really lovely point. I'm really glad you brought this up, Ruth. Thank you so much for listening and contributing. Yes, the locum thing. Let's make sure. I want to chew that over and on a separate episode, if I'm honest. And Ruth, get in touch if you fancy coming on the show, because this is a really interesting thing that I have heard about this, and I've heard that there's been some really well qualified locums that could well have got involved that have been moved aside. And one of the reasons was that when they were doing the big recruitment campaigns, etc., at the start, when they realised that there wasn't as much of a workplace shortage or a need as they thought, then they just doubled down on internal redeployment, even though it wasn't appropriate within skill set, rather than actually doing the hard yards of actually getting some sensible, more sensible policy for anyone that was looking on to get those that are most competent and qualified into that for a time, to not displace such as pediatric physios, etc. And the disruption that we're seeing now across the health sector is often because of this massive overhaul of internal displacement, when a bit of sensible and short-term locum would be perfect for that. Another word for it essentially is this temp workforce would have been better suited potentially as externals for a time. And Ruth's speaking directly to that. I would say that's a really sensible point. I think one caveat on that is that I don't ignore the fact that there are some managers that have had their fingers burnt so many times by shit locums, and I don't want to overlook that. And having been a locum and also been in the process of various different places of recruiting, not directly as a manager, I was never a service manager, but I was involved in sort of the getting locums together and triaging locums to make sure we didn't make the same mistakes. I don't want to ignore the fact that sometimes it's bad experiences with locums and this general poor diversity of practice the unwarranted variation that we often talk about, that's kind of singed people's fingers on that over time, which has made them a bit somewhat reluctant to integrate locums, particularly at times of stress. Sometimes they perceive, rightly or wrongly, that they bring more trouble than they could help with. So that's a concern. I think that issue does loom large. So I want to just finish with. Finish this about COVID, really, is that alongside the fact that COVID isn't causing all these things, but sometimes it's adding fuel to these fires. And what I think it needs to do is it needs to sort of ramp up the maturity of collaboration. But one of the issues that we do continue to face is that there is sometimes confusion with regards to guidance, and the goalposts do continue to move. And I think that one of the most recent things is this test and trace issue that we've been facing, whereby people are confused that the new app on their phone, etc., like what is relevant for them if they happen to have been sat next to someone or in the queue for Tesco, they're in close proximity to someone that then has had COVID, and the difference between that and them being in full PPE and appropriate guidance with an asymptomatic individual, and then the difference between the circumstances of them out and about in day-to-day life and then working, be that in the NHS or in private practice, that's the thing that's confusing people. So they're getting contacted sometimes by test and trace saying, please self-isolate, you've been in close contact and proximity. But then when in contact with the test and trace system, that gets overturned because it turned out that contact was made in a environment in which it's incredibly low likelihood for them to have then been at risk of exposure because PPE, etc. And then there's also these question marks over the legitimacy and accuracy of tests and stuff like that. So it's messy. Now, fortunately for me, here I am, 4 minutes to go, and instead of getting stuck completely into that, I think what is fortunate is I hope this isn't a deflection, but I can simply point you in the direction of Time to Talk on the Physio and Therapist Support Group on Facebook. So if you're watching this on LinkedIn, on Instagram, and wherever we go, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook group, Physio and Therapist Support Group, Time to Talk. Gemma does a live stream now, Wednesdays at 1 o'clock. It's going to be test and trace. It's going to be talking about QR codes. It's going to go through that in much more detail than I can now, and we'll clear that up for you. If you can't wait till then, go to the group, and there's been some great posts on there recently. I won't go through all of it, but please do understand the differences and try to pause before you panic. And it's easier said than done, granted, but there is a relevant difference between our professional behaviours and lives and our personal behaviours and lives at the moment in various ways. And so please bear that in mind when, say, your phone goes off on a test and trace. And is that you as a citizen encountering that? and how will that influence practice? And don't then be naturally alarmist. Sometimes these things are alarming, but just try to, where possible, take a bit of a pause, because people are conflating certain things with the test and trace stuff and stoking that confusion. It's confusing. Don't get me wrong. It's confusing, but I'm just meaning that one of the ways to stoke confusion is to simply, reactively blurt out the frustrations over the fact that, oh my God, this is going to shut me down, and the huge consequences that would face a practice owner, for example. I'm very acutely in touch with that, and concerned about it. But there is a relevant difference between what we're doing and encountering in full PPE under sensible precautions, and there's reasons for that, for us being certainly a more important service in various different ways right now to some of the more superficial things that are going on in society, in which we need to mitigate contact. It's just such a different world. So please do tune into Gemma's stuff. It's just a really brilliant hub, and I'd be concerned if I didn't have that to point you to, then we'd go into it in more detail. But I do have all the confidence in that group. And one of the things that we can show you, let's see, we had that, which was posted alongside Gemma's post. I'm not going to read it all out, but this is the sort of example that I want to talk to you about, mention to you. Sorry, get Gemma's comment out of the road. These are the sorts of comments of which can be helped to break down. This is pinned as one of the announcements on there. So, these are the sorts of examples of which it gives you those isolation criteria and explains some of the exclusions. It's not always going to cover every single thing, and that's what the comment section's for. But let's not be pretending that we can't work through this together. But be, as I said, thoughtful and cautious as to how you might stoke confusion by being confused, not necessarily seeking out the nuances that might be, or looking for similar stories or examples. So that's enough from me. It's been another half an hour. Where's my little frame gone? There we go. I felt naked without that then. So yeah, thanks a lot. Tune in tomorrow. Me and Adam Meekins are going to be chewing over his latest rant about marketing, and then try and tease out whether or not there's any disagreement there between us. I don't know if there is, not necessarily from his post. I'm totally frustrated by some of the same things, so it might be just a co-rant, or it may well be that there's some nuance to be had as to what we maybe do or don't like, or what we feel is legitimate and ethical, because that's often the case, is that what is being missold and sort of overblown and things like that is one of the things that I know me and him often get frustrated about together. But then similarly, there may well be areas where he feels that that's sort of salesmanship that shouldn't be in the industry or shouldn't be ethical, and that I might be more understanding of, and vice versa. I don't know. So we're going to chew over that. So do join us tomorrow if you want me and Meekins to talk about marketing. Please keep your comments coming in, and we'll visit them in other shows or later on in the day. Thanks again, as ever, for everyone tuning in, and for all your thoughtful comments. It's been brilliant. Some lovely feedback. Gemma saying amazing as ever, too kind. And Joe Turner thanking Gemma. And that is, of course, the right thank you to be making, especially when it comes to COVID support. So thanks as ever, everyone. And do keep your comments coming. Definitely the private practice NHS thing is certainly one that needs to roll over. And I'm going to get a few guests on later in the week, I think, to sort of flesh that out a little bit, especially on collaboration, especially any of you that have had experiences with some positive experiences of how we've collaborated over time. I'd be really interested in hearing more about that. But for now, let me hide my frame, bid you farewell as I put my fancy graphic on, and see you tomorrow.